Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for signing on for joining this webinar. My name is Vishesha Bairatna. I'm a Sri Lankan Canadian playwright and dramaturg, currently based in Ottawa, Ontario. It's my pleasure to be moderating the first of this ongoing series of webinars hosted by Teesri Dunya Theatre called Artists United Against Racism. The next panel, I believe, is going to be on Monday at 7:30, called The Costs of EDI, and I'm certainly going to be trying to listen in, although I will not be moderating that one. So this first webinar is called Everyone Can Fight Racism. In this webinar, we'll be focusing primarily on how the arts, such as theater, film, and poetry, can be used to combat systemic racism. But we're also going to try to explore how intersectional activism and community building can be applied even outside of our artistic practices. One item of housekeeping before we really get into it. I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube, as well as being on Zoom. So when we get to the point where you will all be able to ask questions to our amazing panelists, you can just put them into the Q&A, and they're going to be curated by our office manager, Zoe Marner, who has volunteered to be a part of this, just to facilitate the flow of inquiries. So before we begin properly, I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. Teesri Dunya Theatre is committed to engaging our community in dialogue at the intersection of socio-political issues and art. It would be hypocritical to discuss imperial violence in any form without first talking about the colonial violence perpetrated by our settler state Canada here on Turtle Island. Teesri Dunya Theatre creates and operates in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people, who are the rightful custodians of the lands, waters, and resources. We are deeply saddened by the history and ongoing legacy of colonialism, and we remain committed to fighting for Indigenous rights and sovereignty as key guiding principles to decolonization and reconciliation. We intend this land acknowledgement to openly explore our responsibility to redress the generations of colonial violence that is the legacy of settlers on this land. We encourage everyone to further educate themselves on the historical and current colonial forces that have and continue to shape present-day life across Turtle Island, and to take action to support Indigenous anti-colonial struggles to return unceded lands. These actions include stopping the development of pipelines, making efforts to end the war against Indigenous women, and ensuring no more Indigenous children are ever stolen or murdered again, by acting upon the 94 calls to action put forth by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. As such, we'd like to invite everyone to take a moment to acknowledge and or reflect on the rightful custodians of the land that they are currently located in. We encourage you to look up information about your area if you're unsure. For example, I happen to be broadcasting from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial. I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to present in this territory. Let us begin by learning and acknowledging our relationship with colonial violence together. And now, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists to each of you. First, we have Karen Cho, who is a Chinese-Canadian filmmaker known for her socially engaged documentaries. Her films explore themes of identity, immigration, and social justice. Karen has directed the award-winning In the Shadow of Gold Mountain, a documentary about the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act, Seeking Refuge, a film following asylum seekers in Canada, and Status Quo, a documentary on the women's rights movement in Canada. In 2018, Karen was nominated for a Best Directing Canadian Screen Award for her work on CBC's Interrupt This Program, and she's currently shooting a documentary on endangered Chinatowns in North America with I Steal Film. I'm very excited to hear more about that. Mike Fan is our second panelist, is a Chinese-Canadian queer and non-binary performer, an operatic tenor, actor, drag artist, educator, and advocate. Mike transcends discipline, gender, and genre. Mike performs in 10 languages for audiences across North America, Europe, and Australia for Pacific Opera Victoria, Le Monument National, and Tampere Conservatoire. Mike holds degrees in opera and voice, speech arts and drama, and piano performance. Upcoming engagements include Infusion Baroque and La Scena Musicale. Mike's notable social justice leadership positions include the artistic director of Opera Queens and former PGSS Equity and Diversity Commissioner. And finally, we have Ehab Lotayef. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. Ehab is a Canadian IT manager, poet, writer, and community activist of Egyptian origin. Ehab is deeply involved in social and community work, including campaigns against the sanctions and war on Iraq, opposing the blockade of Gaza, which includes also organizing and being on board the Freedom Flotilla, and advocating for Native rights. He has served on many civil boards, both locally and nationally. Ehab is also a founder and former chairperson of both Muslim Awareness Week and the Non à la Loi 21 campaign. As a poet and writer, Ehab has published a bilingual poetry collection, To Love a Palestinian Women, which was published in 2010. And the CBC has also produced his play Crossing Gibraltar in 2006. His writing has also appeared in many anthologies and zines, and he has written numerous op-eds on various subjects in many Canadian papers over the years. So all three of our panelists have incredible histories in both art and activism, and I'm incredibly excited to find out more about their perspectives in combating systemic racism and discrimination, and how we can use those insights to do the same in our own work. So let's dive in. I have questions for each and every one of you, individually tailored to you. And if we have time, once we're done those, I'd like to ask a question that is geared towards all three of you at the same time. So first off, I think I would like to start with Karen. The question I'd like to ask you is, in filming your documentaries, what are some techniques that you've developed in your artistic practices to build relationships between yourself and the marginalized communities that you depict? I'm particularly thinking of your first documentary, In the Shadow of Gold Mountain. And how can we use those techniques to build solidarity between racialized minorities and the dominant culture?
No, a great question. I think like I try to approach my documentary filmmaking, the idea that like everyone is an expert of their own experience, right? So when I come into communities, and it is a privilege, like real people let me into their lives and into their homes, to talk about real truths that they're facing. So the documentaries I make, they do have a point of view. They often have an opinion, or they take a side in a way, but it's really trying to um showcase the voices of and opinions and experiences that the people are going through. So often, if I'm approaching, the first film I did was on the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. It was a history that also touched part of my family. So in a way, I had a personal kind of connection to the subject matter. But often where I begin in, if you're approaching a subject, is looking for really community organizers and activists or people who are on the ground, if because there was a movement for redress at that stage. So people who are advocates for the community or for the cause or whatever the issue might be. And they're often embedded, within the community themselves, within the people. So you start to build a kind of trusting relationship there. I did a film on refugees in Canada, and a lot of I talk with No Borders kind of activists who are working with different asylum seekers, but also immigration lawyers. A lot of them, because they were trusted by their clients, or they had someone who was in a particular situation, and in a way having the cameras there helped their situation, because there was someone to document and witness what was happening there. We went into some of these refugee trials with folks, and even having the judge or people know that there was a witness there outside, on some levels did help. So, and it's also just showing up for the community. But I think we're in an era now where a lot of questions around representation, need to be asked. Whose story is it? Who is telling the story? What kind of story? So in a way, documentary is a parasitic art form, right? Like I only exist, or the art that I make only exists because I'm following real people and real stories, and it's highlighting those things. But some of and the fact that I can put real people on the camera to tell their stories is and I try to make it from their standpoint, but I also recognize that certain stories aren't necessarily mine to tell. So it's also working with the community, understanding what they want, or realizing like this is not my story, but I have some privilege and some opportunities in my own life to get folks who need to tell that story into maybe the right places, because part of my work has also been working on documentary series, and I've worked with more progressive producers. Even the CBC, they have certain criteria. Like when we're telling a story, you need to have a gender balance kind of subjects in the episode, or you try to bring in the film I did on women's rights. Like there was no way I was going to talk about violence against women without breaching the subject of murder and missing Indigenous women, right? So I needed that voice, and it took a really long time to build the trust to get that part of the story, but it was an incomplete story if I didn't talk about that. So I mean, it's a very long-winded answer, but a lot of it is just realizing that the people you're speaking with are the experts. I don't hire necessarily academics or quote unquote voices of God kind of narrators to tell the story. It's the people who are living through whatever it is that is really informs me, and my job is kind of to listen and try to boil down what their experience is, and to humanize it. And I think that's the thing that also bridges it to how do we bridge a dialogue between other communities or other folks. It's if you bring it down to a human level, this is a mother, this is a family, this is a person, whatever experience they're going through, people can relate, even though it's not their experience. And I've always, that's why I start kind of on the level of the person actually experiencing the thing, because it just makes something that is sometimes theoretical or a bit abstract. It resonates stronger with folks, and who aren't part necessarily of that experience, but you can bring people into the argument, or create a kind of dialogue around it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I write fiction, but I find that even in my own work, that the personal is often a gateway to exploring the larger political issues of race and discrimination as well. Um, and I guess, yeah, with what you said about representation and who gets to tell whose story. I mean, I suppose everyone has their kind of it's a tricky line to walk in a way, because everyone has their own kind of internal barometer of ethical good sense. And I guess that, like, would you say that, like, stories that have kind of a personal historical resonance for you, like you said with the Chinese head tax and how your own family was affected by that, do you find that that's often like what pushes you to say, okay, yes, I'm going to tackle this story. I'm going to go ahead and, like, shine a light on this particular issue.
Well, yeah, I mean, in some ways, and that's why I've kind of in a way come full circle, because the first film I did was on the Chinese community, and this latest film now is on Chinatowns in North America. So in some ways, I feel I can pronounce more of an ownership or a connection on the story, and not be so nervous about, is it my story? Like, can I tell the story? But it's also finding your place or your point of view. Like the first film I did, I had a kind of click moment while making the film, realizing that because I was half white, um, I could impart an interesting viewpoint on the head tax, because at that time there was a real split in the Chinese Canadian community. Should we be asking for redress? Like we're Canadians now, like let the past be the past kind of thing. And then when I looked in my own family history, like all my relatives from Britain and Scotland were being given free land, to come here to settle in Canada, while this Chinese side of my family faced exclusion or head tax, all these kind of things. So it was actually in realizing the kind of intersection of my own personal identity that I was able to bring a viewpoint that could bring other people into the story, like regular Canadians that be like, oh, my grandfather who came from Europe or who came from, he didn't face this same thing. So was it really fair? So it's trying to find your place in being able, or your point of view in being able to tell the story, or maybe open up the dialogue to a wider audience.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's a challenge for sure, but it's definitely a worthy one. Thank you so much. All right. Mike, Mike Fan, are you ready to be in the hot seat next?
Real question is, are you ready for the answers? But no, yes, yes, ready, willing, and just so thrilled to be here with both of these amazing guests and you moderating and all the wonderful folks at Tisri Dunia for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Um, all right. So my question for you is, what are some of the primary obstacles that you have encountered as a racialized artist, a queer racialized artist working in theater and the performing arts?
Yes, it's a great question. It's a question I'm very excited to talk about and interested to talk about because I think that points to one of the big problems of opera, which is my primary medium, and of course some of the other disciplines I work in as well too, because it isn't being talked about enough or as much in a lot of the other mainstream genre. And of course, I want to acknowledge first of all. Also, I'm coming to you from Toronto, from Takaranto, so I'm not currently in Montreal in Chichage, but I did my master's there at the Charlotte School of Music, and it was my home for 2 years. And I was just there last week for a contract, so it's a place very dear and near to my heart. But also thinking of the land here, I'm very privileged to live and create and work now as my home base. It's my chosen field, of course, is classical music and opera. It's a field I love very much. I began as a child, 6 years old, as a young pianist, and then I took a little detour and tried to go into medicine, and quite literally discovered my voice at 21 as an opera singer. So classical music and music has been very close to my heart for a long time, but at the same time, going into this career as a profession, especially as an opera singer, there were a lot of obstacles I did not really expect, and I began to learn about this very loaded legacy because it's a Eurocentric art form. I didn't go into Chinese opera, but I went into Western opera because this is the repertoire that really spoke to me. It's the repertoire that I had exposure to as someone living in a very small Ontarian town. I recently actually had a project which I'm sure hopefully I'll get to talk about later, where I actually got to merge Chinese and Western operas, and it was my first time learning about Chinese opera. But and I was saying that if I had been exposed to this, maybe I would have gone down a different route. But I just didn't have that experience, growing up where I was in primarily in Guelph, Ontario, which was not exactly the most diverse of places. But there's this Eurocentric legacy of this beautiful repertoire that stemmed from Italy in the 1500s, and we have all this gorgeous repertoire from France, Germany, Italy, England, and unfortunately, there is new work being created, but in opera, it's still very rare to see it performed at a really big and high level. Oftentimes, it's the indie companies, the smaller companies that are promoting and producing new work. And if you think of the Opéra de Montréal right there in Montreal, the Canadian Opera Company, which I live about half an hour away from, Metropolitan Opera, the big opera houses of the world, it's still primarily this big canon of work from primarily not even the 1500s, but more from probably 1700s to 1900s. And there's so much beautiful repertoire, but there's this big tendency to market these works that have been around for a while, that sell tickets, the Carmen, Traviata, Madame Butterfly. But not only is there so much other work that was written around that time, there's work being written now, there's voices and stories that are from today and the recent past that are being told. And unfortunately, as well, it means that a lot of the repertoire for someone like me, as an Asian person, that really is for a community that is Asian, that is queer, that is non binary, is very limited. And so we have these big operas like Madame Butterfly and Turandot are probably the biggest in the traditional canon for Asian people. But then it's also a place where we get pigeonholed, and something really disconcerting I see, like for example, let's think for the Met, which of course everyone points fingers at because it's the biggest opera company in the world, and it's the most renowned, and it's where a lot of people point attention to. But at the same time, for example, I've seen so many times over the years where there's an Asian soprano who's cast in Madame Butterfly, and you can go in the archives, and I've done it, and I've looked at someone's career and said, okay, this person has sung basically 90% Madame Butterfly, and she's Chinese and not even Japanese, which the opera is written for, and she's singing all these other roles in Europe, in China, in Asia, and South America, and yet, especially North America, I think there's but even in other companies as well, but I notice especially here, there's such a tendency to pigeonhole, and we can do other repertoire, and sometimes we're pressured into repertoire that's not appropriate for voice types, because not every singer is going to be right for Turandot or Madame Butterfly. Those are two very niche operas. So for me, it's been very disconcerting, and of course, having my background as a pianist, I'm often asked if I'm a violinist or a pianist. I don't play any string instruments. I did come up as a pianist, but there's so few opera singers that really make it to a high level that are of Asian descent, especially in the West, and we're still seen as, as new to this field or othered, and because we have had this legacy of very great classical artists from China in the instrumental field, but opera is still a new frontier, and there's been fortunately a number of South Korean artists that have really made it on the big world stages, but especially for Chinese opera singers, Chinese diaspora, my experience is still relatively new. And when we walk in the audition room, we're auditioning often for these big traditional productions that were written by white creators for white performers set in, white countries, or otherwise they are, but they're exoticized. And so when we step in the room and I sing, Lenski's aria, Alfredo's aria, there hasn't necessarily been a face or voice like mine singing that kind of repertoire. So it takes a lot of imagination often for these casting directors, opera companies to kind of think outside the box because they're used to so much seeing the characters, hearing the characters in a certain way. So for me, I really realized I haven't found so much satisfaction kind of breaking the mold, creating new work, and I am interested in other disciplines, but part of it is also that there is so much more openness in film, in theater, to other voices, to contemporary voices in a way that's so much more accessible. So I find that much more satisfying, and I'd be engaged because that is beginning to happen. It's still, an issue in Hollywood, and it's still an issue in theater companies, of course, of diversity and representation. But we think of it in opera, where there's so many opera companies where there's really literally not a single person of color in any of the boards or any of the administrative staff. Even on the stages, sometimes it's very, very. There's so much work that needs to be done. But my work in drag actually kind of really unlocked a lot of that. And in 2017, I created my drag persona Tanya's Mania, and I'd be performing opera and drag specifically. And it really invited so much interest and response from people that I was not expected for, because I've been so bullied about my race and my sexuality and gender identity as a child, and it really unlocked so many doors, and things kind of kept on building there. And in 2020, in the fall of 2020, in the height of the pandemic, it was just very interesting timing, but it just seemed the right time where there was so much happening in terms of an openness to social justice, and even finally in classical music, where it was so dormant for so long. And I ended up finding my opera company, Opera Queens, and we've since done a lot of live performances in Montreal. We've done some virtual performances. We have some film projects that we're currently being edited and releasing this year as well too. And it's been very exciting, and primarily my goal is really to provide a platform for BIPOC and or queer artists, because even as a queer artist, there are some other opera companies or companies doing work with queer singers, but oftentimes these are the white singers, and then the people of color who are also queer are sitting on the sidelines being like, well, hello, we're also here. And I know there's so many artists of mine that have such talent as performers and have such interesting stories to tell, and we're not being showcased and featured. And so when I got grants and scholarships, from SSHRC, from Canada Council, I was very adamant about hiring people that were people of color and queer. And just being in a cast, it was my first experience that I had to create myself, where I was in a cast where the majority was actually BIPOC and or queer. And it was such an amazing experience because we had so many parallels and moments where we said, oh, I feel this too, I feel this way about this work, I feel this way about this work as well too. And a moment of not only the performance part, but just in the rehearsal rooms and the collaboration of having people with similar points of view. It was very, very exciting and something I want to see more of. And that I know for me is one of the places where I feel that work is happening. And it's been a really exciting, you know, putting a spin on the work. For example, Carmen, one of my favorite operas. I've sung a little bit of Carmen before, but be able to do this opera and to have an Asian Carmen such as myself, which we don't normally see because it is a role that can be sung by Asians, but Asians are not being cast in the opera, for example. Or for example, with our Carmen, we one concert we had a Spanish drag queen who dances flamenco to perform this repertoire. To have the original voices that the groups of people that are presented, the actual groups of people coming in to perform this repertoire, to engage with the repertoire instead of it being whitewashed or being sidelined or racialized. And we've been part of creating new work as well too. We created a 48-hour opera for Lucky Penny Opera, and myself, I got to write a character that is Chinese Canadian like myself, and I had someone who's of Thai descent and someone of Mexican descent, and we wrote basically ourselves into a new piece, and it was so exciting to see it and see people watch it and respond to our stories, because for so long I've been, and I continue to, because I love the repertoire and I don't want to stop, you know, singing this repertoire of the standard canon, which is really beautiful. But for so long, and I continue to wear so many hats and characters and roles that are not me, that are not queer, that are not Asian, that are not non-binary. And at some point, it's wonderful, and it's part of why we are, theater and performance artists, because we want to escape sometimes. But at some point, I do want to be myself. I do want to play a character and play for communities that do look like me, that, and tell our story. And then just one final point as well, a recent project I've been doing with Pacific Opera Victoria. They created a civic engagement program, which is fantastic, and the whole goal is to kind of bring the civic engagement, the equity, diversity, social justice work into an opera space and to kind of uplift that platform. And so for me, my project, I sort of was given the funding, the resources, the platform to create a project. And so that's where I decided I was really curious about Chinese opera. And there's the character of the dam performer, who is traditionally a male performer that plays female roles, very similar to my dread work, and the castrato tradition in Western opera. And so I filmed it, and it's currently being edited and will be released in March. And I performed repertoire from mainly the Western opera canon that was set in Asia, from Turandot. There's a piece called La Japonaise by Pauline Viardot, woman composer. There's an aria that I sang by Chinese Canadian composer Chan Kanin, which was very exciting as well too. And part of it I filmed as my male presenting self, and the other part of the repertoire I filmed in Chinese opera costume and makeup and hair. And so even just the transformation process of seeing myself in this look, it was just so affirming, and learning so much about the history of Chinese opera, that each hair piece is made of real human hair that is stuck on the face with, tree sap imported from China. All these little things that I never grew up learning about. It was very exciting, and so all that is something I want to share with audiences, and, also for me as well too, because so often these stories and this history and this kind of intercultural collaboration and interdisciplinary collaboration is not there. And I'm really excited that now there's beginning to be an acceptance of it, an openness to it, and an opportunity for it to happen, because it brings such value to not only the performers such as myself, but I hope audiences, to bring new people into the theater and for them to see themselves represented, because the age-old question in classical music is that audiences are getting older and dying. Where are the young people? Where are the diverse audiences? Well, if the work doesn't reflect them and tell their stories, who's going to be interested to come and to, feel that they can be part of this repertoire? So that's just a little bit of a kind of overview, I guess, of the situation, sort of my experience and kind of some of the kind of work that I'm trying to do that is, you know, engaging with this repertoire and trying to put a new spin, let's say, bring some light and life into it.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's incredible. It's the, it's the age-old dilemma for artists of color, isn't it? We have to either wait to be cast in a colorblind
Hmm.
production of,
Yeah.
Shakespeare or whatever,
Yeah.
or create our own work. And that pressure is real, and I feel that. And I think it's so wonderful that you've managed to do that. You've managed to kind of forge your own identity as a performer, you know, and to kind of just to disrupt the form, as it were, which we're all trying to do. Thank you
Thank
so much,
you.
Mike. All right, Ahab. We haven't heard from you yet. I have I guess, kind of a multifaceted question for you. Um, Given all of the projects that you've done and all of the kind of activist projects you've engaged in, I'm curious to find out from you, how do you see your art kind of intersecting with your activism in your efforts to kind of combat racism, neocolonialism, state violence? Do you view them as one and the same, or kind of separate facets of the same kind of purpose? And what do you think is the most effective way for artists to combine their work with this kind of activism and civil disobedience, to create social change?
You know, activism, like art, really, in my opinion, has to stem from down deep inside, from a strong urge inside you to be effective, to be connectable, or connecting, to be able to connect with the people, to create a movement or to be a part of a movement. But there is a major difference, at least in the way I produce art compared to my engagement as an activist. Um, my engagement as an activist takes apart from my engineering studies, my engineering practice, where I like to plan things. It is more planned, more structured, more thought of in advance, and that is a major difference to whatever art I produce. I mean, I have always felt very thankful that I do not and never was in a position where I had to produce art to earn a living or to make ends meet. And that was a great comfort to me, because that gives me the opportunity to create art when it comes from deep inside. And if it doesn't come for whatever length of period of time, then that's fine as well. I'm busy with other things. Yes, of course, whatever art I produce, whether it is poetry, whether it's theater, whether it's writing, whether it's photography, I did some photography as well, comes from the same person, comes from the same mind, comes from the same feeling that makes me want to be engaged socially as an activist. But it's more raw, it's more spontaneous compared to activism that I can say that I have. At certain points in my life, I was a professional activist, meaning, like, when I was, for example, doing the coordination for the Freedom Flotilla worldwide with different campaigns, that was like a project management thing more than just an activist thing. Like setting up communication systems, setting up a timeline, coordinating money coming from different donors from different places in the world. So it's a big project. It's not just like, let's do a demonstration tomorrow and we're going to walk down the street and pick it in front of Justin Trudeau's office, for example. It's a very different level than that. So I learned to be a very much structured and disciplined activist, compared to art, where I view myself more as a very spontaneous artist that has no reason not to be. There are very few instances where I pushed myself to produce art, basically. I collaborate a lot with my niece who lives in Toronto, and she's a musician. Her husband's a musician. They have more than one band collective, and I write a lot of, or they actually sing a lot of what I have written. But in very rare cases, it is where that I wanted to write, I wanted them to sing about something in particular. So I wrote something with the intention that, it works for that. And that was one of those instances I remember was about Omar Khadr, who was the child soldier that was arrested by the Americans and tried and kept in Guantanamo, and his life is really, it deserves an opera to be written about it, really. And I wanted them to, when he was released from Guantanamo, I wanted them to write, to sing something about him, and I wrote something with that intention. But as I said, this is very, very, very rare in my experience. And also, I believe that for somebody who also wrote many op-eds and articles, I feel that the art is not an op-ed, it's a structured piece of writing that needs to explain something. It's something from the heart to the heart. And thus, if it doesn't come out of the heart, it doesn't reach the heart on the other side. So it's not intentional. It is very much spontaneous compared to the activist side, which is more planned and structured and intentional. But of course, they all come from the same mind and from the same heart.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it sounds to me that that's this driving factor is kind of what we all have in common. This desire to, whenever we start an artistic project, it has to be something that comes from a very passionate and deep emotional place, something that keeps us up at night, something that we want to see actually changed. Activism is, I mean, the kind of activism that you're talking about, I personally wish I had more proficiency at that. It's a real challenge for me to kind of maintain that strict level of planning and discipline throughout. Whereas, yeah, if I'm starting to write a play, I can feel that I can let that feeling kind of sustain me throughout. Um, yeah, but I think, like you said, it all comes from the same mind and the same heart, which we all share. And with that, I would like to pose a question now to all of you, so that we can kind of open this up and kind of get a conversation going between between the four of us. Um, and this is one which I am very curious to hear all of your opinions on. Um, since race and class are inextricably intertwined, how do you all think that we can successfully break through these kinds of socioeconomic barriers of access to reach as many people as possible with our art? Anyone can kind of go first if they feel. Mike, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I love this question. I actually had an experience last summer, rehearsing, which was very interesting to me. We had a moment with a singer who is BIPOC, and we were working with a director that wasn't, and we were talking about this character who is a queen, and she was saying that this character is, imagine yourself being very rich, very white, and it wasn't kind of a conscious kind of microaggression, but it was just a lack of awareness of that socioeconomic status isn't linked to race, and oftentimes I think there has been and continue to be associations due to colonization, due to lots of events over the centuries that have resulted in class distinctions, especially in the West. And people of color haven't always been seen as, you know, as being able to, or we're not only not be able to see, but we're just prohibited or not allowed to even attain wealth or move up the socioeconomic ladder. So it's kind of moment for me, you know, of realizing that, you know, that there is so much that we have to overcome. And I think that's why it's so important to engage with directors and why we need the backstage stuff, you know, whether it's stage managers, conductors, music staff, the people you don't see, you know, from marketing to administration. Because if we don't change the way that people are being cast, that stories are being told and directed, then, you know, those little things are going to continue to, and not so little sometimes, going to continue to place themselves in the art and restrict who can be seen in the pieces and how they're interpreted and the works that are chosen to be presented. So there are moments of that where I remembered that, you know, or I'm reminded that that work is so important and that it really needs to be everywhere, because even the way someone markets a show, because I've been in shows where I haven't been, you know, I wasn't included in the publicity, and or for example, the makeup was not designed for a person of my complexion, and I had to basically do it myself because there wasn't experience or someone knowledgeable enough of other skin tones. So there's so much of that work that needs to be done behind the scenes. And so for me, and also I think the primary thing, and something Ahab and Karen have talked about, that I feel as well too, is that the stories need to be told, because if people don't see these stories, people don't know that they exist, and then they don't know the need of those stories to be told, and then people are not interested to come and see the stories. You know, I know for me, one of the most exciting things about our shows at Opera Queens has been people who've come to me to speak after and say that, you know, I had this one student, we performed at McGill, and she said, I'm a jazz student, but I've never really come to the classical concerts because I just never thought it was for me. But the fact that we had people that of color and who were queer, something spoke to it about her, and she came and experienced it. And there's been a lot of people too that are just totally new to opera, or don't usually go to a live performance, and they came and experienced it for the first time, which is very exciting, because that's exactly what we want to do. And I think it's living proof that if you actually engage people with stories that matter, told in a way that reflects them and is more diverse in terms of the casting and the whole crew, it creates that change and brings other people into the fold, and hopefully inspires them then to go tell their own stories or get involved in whatever way they can, because we need that manpower to continue to be part of that change and diversity that we want to see.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, I'm gonna think about it from a specific angle. The angle I'm gonna think about it is, you need to tell your own story. Only you, you as a group, as a community, as whatever, need to tell your own story. But also here, partnerships are extremely important. Allies are extremely important, because sometimes you also need somebody from outside to advocate for the cause of this group. I'm thinking here as an activist, really more than an artist. To create, and that's why I have always seen the importance of not limiting movements to those ethnically or culturally or nationality-wise belonging to that cause. Otherwise, it remains limited to a certain level. And in some cases, I see the owners of the cause want to do that. They want to be the only ones advocating for their cause. There is something right about that, because they're the only ones who understand the intricacies of the problem and can see the solution in their own way. But I believe in the global work in general, and more we are living in that world, and there is no turning back. So I strongly advocate for an open world of activism, of collaboration that includes those who understand the issue because they live it, and includes those who look at it from the outside as well with good intention and want to want to help. And this is really the way to really efficiently fight against these segregations and colonialism that want to stick some of us within niches. And I can give Tisri Dunya as a good example. I know Tisri's history, and that Tisri was established to give a voice to the artists who cannot find their voice in the mainstream. But at the same time, I think Tisri, with its evolution, has now become a company for everybody to work in. And it is not, it's more of a state of mind rather than an ethnicity or a background, which is great.
Yeah, if I can piggyback off what Ahab is saying, I mean, I for me, because I work in documentary, like I can use my art or the films that I make as a tool for social justice. And it is so important to be able to, it's like the give back to the community, right? Like I don't want to just go into a community, take their story and walk away, with the broadcasting rights or something. So, in terms of, like class divide and access and all of that, a lot of the launches for the documentaries are in the community. Like that's why the first film I did was launched in Chinatowns across North America, and the community itself really took ownership of the film because it was their story to tell, and they were able to get the word out about the redress movement by having screenings of the film and using it as a tool for advocacy. But even today, it's like you realize like I am in a privileged position. Like I do have a broadcaster. I have like a certain amount of power to get things out. So and I'm working with a really great production company now where, we are doing deals with the community where the raw footage for the film goes back to the people that we're filming with, right? So they can tell their own stories and they can use that as their archive or create, I'm working with the Montreal, the Chinatown Working Group, and the raw footage of the film is used to also make videos to advocate for Chinatown. So it's just, things like that. But I've also come from an age where, like buying a camera, like it was so expensive, so inaccessible. And now, with your cell phone, you can make broadcast quality 4K, like social movements are done through TikTok videos and Twitter, like right from the front lines, so there is a power in being able to broadcast yourself from YouTube. But, to go also to what Mike was saying in terms of representation and who gets access to the story and all that, I've also been in these meetings where you're kind of pitching an idea for a film, like this Chinatown film. And I won't name the broadcaster, but I was in a room or in a Zoom room with a Quebec broadcaster, and they told me, this is not a Quebec story. And it was a story about the last Chinatown in Quebec, Montreal's Chinatown. And I was told that that's not a Quebec story, and then I go to the next broadcaster, they're like, oh, this is so amazing. We never hear this side of the story. So it's like, it's an old adage, but it's like, you can't be what you can't see. And sometimes changing the narrative, the act of being your genuine self, sharing your story, your reality is actually like, it's a very rebellious act because it's a way of constantly challenging that narrative of like who and what is a Canadian or who and what is the quote unquote truth. So I mean, part of just, I don't know, like changing things is also on a very small scale, just telling your own story. To kind of really shake up the status quo of and also for the arts, the funding for artists of color, like so often the art you make is seen as like folk art or a culture, like it's not high art, it's not ballet or opera, it's folk art, and you don't access the same funding. So even the funding structures for what is considered culture, what is considered art also need to change. So anyway, those are my thoughts on kind of democratizing things or making them more accessible.
I have a question to Mike, actually. Can I ask a question?
Sure, go
Yes, I
ahead.
actually had a response to what you were saying as well too. But yeah, I'm curious to hear your question too. Maybe
Okay,
it's maybe we're thinking the same.
I'll ask you the question, and then you can answer and comment and mix it all together. Sure. And my question is, I mean, I totally understand how artists of colors or BIPOC in general are pigeonholed in certain roles. But of course, the other side of the coin is the black face or white mainstream artists doing
Mhm.
roles that are written for BIPOC people. How can we reach, in your opinion, in your experience, a situation where there is not this territorial ownership of the roles, where anybody can play any role, but it will go both ways? It will surely go both ways then. How do you view that?
I love this question, and this is something we're very much talking about because, and from the Asian perspective, with the parallel of Yellowface, because we see these production of Butterfly, Turandot, as I mentioned, with, the whole get up. But the other flip side is now, like for example, the Met was they did their first non-blackface Othello, the Verdi opera, a number of years ago, and companies now are also doing productions where they're also presenting the opera, but no longer in the traditional setting, even this traditional culture. But then the problem is, for example, like Paris Opera, I saw they did a production of Aida in the Pandemic in France, and it's set in Africa, and they just totally took it out of Africa, but the cast was still predominantly white. But then to me, the issue I find with that is, well, okay, we've gotten away with the blackface issue, but now how does this become now almost exclusively white story, right? And the same with, for example, vice versa. I know there's a lot of black singers that have trouble being cast as Madame Butterfly. They're wonderful black sopranos, for example, and many other singers that sing this repertoire very well, and yet they want only someone who's Asian, or maybe they'll cast someone white, but then someone else who's another ethnicity, like Latinx, black, doesn't necessarily get that access to that repertoire as easily too in a casting setting. And so I had a conversation about this with an artist the other day who's black, for Opera Queen's podcast, who's one of our performers, and they were talking about how when there's, not to say that it's the rule, but they're saying it almost has to be, when there's enough performers of color performing the traditional repertoire that has been imagined for white people, then they get the permission to perform in that repertoire, because it's very much the opposite. There's been far many more white butterflies, white Aidas, and then there has been black Aidas even, or Asian butterflies. And this is why, for example, Tasty Dunya, I'm very excited to see that they embody this multicultural platform, because I don't think that white performers should be excluded from, this work. That's why for us, for our company, and for collaborations I'm in, I want to make sure that there are still white allies, people who are white, because I think there's a lot of fear, there's of course the white fragility, but there's fear that there's not enough seats at the table, that suddenly if the people of color are going to come in, where are the jobs, where are the roles going to be for the white performers? But I absolutely think everybody can and should play that repertoire. But at the same time, for example, like a show like Madame Butterfly, why does it then have to be only exclusively Asian people, And so for me, for example, like some of the operas we did, Agrippina, Carmen, I'm really interested in showing a broad range of colors and ethnicities, also body sizes too, because the diversity doesn't come just in terms of the racial identity, but plus sizes, people who are disabled. I was watching this interview with an American baritone who was born without a lower arm and a hand, and he's also encountered discrimination in terms of that stigma. So I think that kind of realm of diversity need to expand, because there are so many people that are wonderful in this repertoire, and we shouldn't just be seeing one person, even if it is written for this one group, because already we're seeing in film and TV, there's such, like fantasy shows I love, because there's such an amazing diversity in those worlds, because it's not tied to a specific place or time, and then the diversity is just astounding. But I think it should be everywhere, including opera. It's beginning to happen, but still in a lot of the big houses, it's a tradition that's carried on for centuries, and it's very slow to change. And some companies are on board, and some you see their roster or the works they're putting on, and there's still so much work to go. But thank you for bringing this up. This is a big question, especially with this beautiful repertoire. And I think, again, some people are also worried, like, oh, maybe I don't want to put on Othello anymore, or Butterfly, or there's a new opera. Actually, speaking of what Karen's saying, that Vancouver City Opera is putting on called Chinatown, and I think then companies are then also afraid to put these works on because they don't want to tackle the issues. But I think you have to, and you have to do something new with it. And just doing it the same old way is not acceptable either.
Great. Well, if no one else has any questions for each other, I think now would be a good time to open it up to the people listening in at home. If you have any questions, if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask the panelists, remember you can type it in the Q&A box. And we have one here, actually. This is a good one. What can, sorry, excuse me, what can BIPOC artists do to vet slash ensure organizations that they work with? What can they do to vet organizations they work with to ensure that they're safe and inclusive for everyone working and volunteering in the organization? Who would like to take this one first?
Maybe I can speak to that possibly. I sat on the board of ALAN, which is the English Language Arts Network, for quite a few years, and we were, we had an inclusion, or we still have an inclusion kind of working group, and put together an inclusion policy, which is something that so many different groups are putting together now. So on a very basic level, if the group you're working with has thought about inclusion and is incorporating it into their daily practice, that would be, a good sign. And if this conversation is totally not existing, and it would be a red flag. You have to look at their hiring policies, the kind of stories that they tell, the projects that they make. This is a kind of, I guess, a good indicator, or a testing of if it's someone you want to collaborate with or not.
Yeah, oh, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I got the tower built, ready, 2 ships are coming.
Thank you. I tell we're all very good Canadians now. No, you go first. No, you go first. I love this question, and it's something for me I've been very careful about myself too, because it's one has to be really very careful with the intention sometimes, and in who we partner, collaborate with, choose to work with. I know that in opera, for example, there's the tendency to go with, oh, I want to go to the biggest company, the oldest company, the most established company, but oftentimes those companies are also not open to the most diversity, and are the hardest to accept change. And sometimes for me at this point, of course I do want to perform internationally and at a high level, but I would rather tell stories and be part of organizations where I feel good about myself working there, where I feel valued as exactly who I am, that I don't have to hide a part of my identity in order to satisfy anybody. Because frankly, no other organization that is acceptable, and it shouldn't be. But there's things that opera companies get away with so much that is just not acceptable. But yeah, but whether it's a theater company I've worked with, or an opera company, or a film crew, we're really lucky in the digital age, the information age. There's so much data at our fingertips. As I mentioned, the Met Opera, they have an archive, and you can go in and search productions back to like the early 1900s, I believe into the 1800s, and see, you can pick an artist, see what they sang, you can see how many times an opera has been performed. There's such data available. Go on any website and you can see, production photos from decades, and you can see, well, how diverse are they casting? Who's on the board? Who is the administration? You can go on the team and see, they have the administrator, they have the music director, they have the assistant to the music director, they have all the cast, they have the bios, they have the names of the people, and just go through and see. And for me, one of the big tests, especially now that there's been a big breakthrough in social justice in 2020, in the pandemic, and especially after George Floyd and the Atlanta shootings, there's a lot of companies now, I know it for sure in opera, because there was so little that they were scrambling to get their act together, hiring new diverse administrators and people in casting. And you also want to see, how recent is this? Is there a lot of diverse voices in casting happening just since 2020, or has it been something that's happened for longer? Because there have been companies that have been doing it for ages, and some companies that are really literally getting on board like this year, and and seeing. And I think the world of arts is very small, not just in opera, in film, in theater, I'm sure in writing, and a lot of times when I go on, I see, oh, I know this person who has sung with this company or is a friend of a friend, and go to those people if you know them, and ask them. Well, obviously it's probably not a good idea to cold call someone you don't know at all, but usually I have a friend of a friend or a friend of a friend or someone who's worked with or being part of the company, and I'm always interested to talk to them and ask firsthand, what was your experience like, especially if they're a person of color, someone who's queer. Was this, and they often give it to you straight because obviously when they're in the gig and they're part of the show, they want to present a positive image. They want to be, a good representation for the company. But when you talk to them, oftentimes the experience does not really match what you've seen. So it's important to know, because stepping in that space, I am going to have a different experience than my white colleagues or my straight colleagues or my male or female identifying colleagues, and it's very important to know kind of firsthand, well, what is experience like for someone like me, because just because someone else has had a good experience doesn't necessarily reflect what my experience is going to be, being marginalized coming to those spaces. So I always do my research. I encourage people to too, because if you do it, there is the information out there, and so you should definitely use it and be prepared.
I would also expand the question a little, because as Peter asked the question on the Q&A, he used two words. He said safe and inclusive, and that is where I look at any establishment, any organization, as not only regarding the BIPOC people, but as safety is something that is beyond any certain group. And usually the establishments that are concerned about safety and the rights of those who are participating or working or volunteering or whatever would also be quite positive towards inclusiveness and towards diversity. So I think even if we are talking about venturing into a company that does not usually or doesn't have the history of working with BIPOC people, you can still read a lot from the history of that company. And again, it's the global vision about there are many types of problems, and they all really at the end can be dealt with through tools that affect many aspects of the problem, and not only resolve it for a certain group. So that where there is no gender equality, for example, in a company, would show that if BIPOC people are also involved, they will be treated negatively. There's no respect to minorities. Then as well, you will see that women are probably treated worse in the same environment. So one thing can show the other, and such an organization would need reform and would need everybody to push it to reform. And yes, I think the positive side here to mention is, as Karen mentioned about Elan, I also, working with through on the board of Quebec Writers Federation, for example, I see there is a lot of interest in tackling those issues. Sometimes it is dangerous in a way, and I'm not referring to any particular organization, but it's dangerous in a way because you're guilty till proven innocent, which is rather than innocent till proven guilty, but we have seen so much guilt that in some people's minds it justifies that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's there's so many different factors that we have to look at, and it's so important to do our due diligence and to do as much research as we can to make sure we're being treated fairly. Um, all right, we have another question. It's a bit of a three-in-one, which is interesting. But yeah, the question is, what recourses are available to BIPOC artists who are feeling abused and targeted because of their racial origin? What about the fear of backlash and power dynamics? And does anyone have any experience with human rights complaints?
Sure, I'm happy to speak about this too. This is really what goes back to what Ehab says as well too, because not only equity, diversity, but with organizations, especially in opera, Me Too as well, any social justice movement, social movement has also been slow to infiltrate classical music and opera, because oftentimes we are a little bit out of the mainstream and out of the public eye, compared to pop music or film or the mainstream media, and so people are not aware of the kind of abuses and the abuses of power and the racism, sexism that goes on, and fortunately, it's taking hold as well too. We've seen a number of really established big names, Placido Domingo and James Levine being called out, and actions being taken by companies to remove them from positions of power, and the hiring of new people in these positions, but it is still very difficult. I think, especially as a young artist, I'm still relatively young, and I still experience it as well. But even someone coming up who's still studying or really just entering the professional world, it's very scary because you don't want to, damage those important connections, because you never know who you're going to be auditioning for, a company that you want to work for, being too vocal and all of that. There's that fear, I think. But I think it's really knowing your audience and going back to, again, allies. Not only that BIPOC, but there are those that are out there that are not BIPOC, not queer, but they are really wonderful allies that that are coming from a place that's very good of heart. I know for me, example, at McGill, my teacher John Master, I'm very that is the name I will say, because he's been absolutely wonderful and such a supporter of myself. My master's recital, I got a Shirk grant to do a recital in drag on a woman composer, and he was so supportive and made so much happen for me that was so wonderful. And the same thing with our opera department there, with Pacific Opera Victoria. Rebecca Haas, who's the director of community engagement there, has been such an important ally and has given me such a platform. But at the same time, you have to know your audience, because there are some people that were going to be really open and give you that door and that pass to kind of be more of yourself and show more of that. And there are other people that I have had those allies, for example, that know me and know who I am, and have warned me and said, this person probably isn't so open to it, so you're going to have a master class with them, so just be prepared in terms of what you were bringing, and just know that sometimes you're not able to show all of the kind of assets in your collection, all of who you are to everybody, because sometimes it's not safe, it's not a person that's going to respond to that well, and know that there are people, and to go towards those people that are going to be your champions, that you don't have to hide part of yourself. But there are necessities sometimes in the industry, when you're, especially in opera, where it's so multidisciplinary. You have dance, you have theater, you have stagehands, you have whole orchestra, you have so many people involved, that it's very likely that not all of those people are always going to be receptive or open. But it's knowing that, finding those people who do resonate with you and building that trust, and finding that group that you can you can be really totally yourself with. And then, of course, with like a lot of other companies, with companies, they often do have HR, they have management, they have for example, I just joined the Canadian Actors Equity Union as well too. There are unions as well, and so those are all people that you should go to, report things, and continue to be part of it, because sadly, a lot of times, even the way they're handled are not just. But I think we really need to continue to report this behavior, call it out, and to find others as well to support us. Sometimes you don't want to go through it alone. You want to have people around you that support you, that can also document things for you as well too, and have people that are on your side. But it needs to be called out, and I think again, there's a fear of, or this, not necessarily that it's even a legitimate fear, but it's an internalized voice of fear that, oh, if I do this, will I be able to advance, and things like that. But to be honest, so much of the work that I've been involved in, including this panel with TC Dunia, there are the organizations and people out there that will hire you for exactly who you are. I got a theater contract with the Baroque Ensemble from a show that I did with Opera Queens, which was mostly Carmen and drag. Who would have thought, right? But there is work, and it happens, and it's not necessarily in the traditional way, but I would rather it be that way than all my life trying to fit in boxes and to please people that don't value me and don't offer me work that's interesting and tailor fit to me as a person. So that's what I would say. But it is definitely, a fine line, especially as a young artist, when you don't have so much clout yet or reputation. But that's why, as Ahab was saying, find those allies who can help lift you up and help give you resources, and know that you're not alone, because there's artists out there that are willing to be on your side and to vouch for you.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of follow what you're saying, in my industry, in a way, the Me Too movement, sexual abuse, things that women were facing, really came to a fore, or came to a head. I'm not sure, like, to go back to the question, folks, who are being targeted or abused because of their racial origins, I'm not sure there's the same kind of mechanisms. But what we saw from Me Too is the strength in numbers, right? When it gives, when other people are experiencing the same thing, and are willing to talk publicly about it, which does involve a certain amount of risk, and especially for artists, a certain amount of career risk or backlash. It is a safer space, but you do need to look at, to the unions. If whatever discipline you're in, there are unions or other associations that can speak on your behalf, or put in criticisms, so you're not necessarily alone in bringing your case forward, or bringing your issues forward. But I think it also just harkens back to systemic issues, right? Like in the funding structure, who are making these decisions, who's doing the hiring, who's putting whatever story on, or allowing certain abuses to continue. So until this kind of larger structural change behind the scenes, in a way, happens, um the space, it won't be as safe as it needs to be for people to be able to come forward.
Ahab, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions that we want answered? Now is the time. Lay it on us.
Yeah, and in the meantime, I just wanted to really echo what Karen said, is that unfortunately, yeah, especially for race, it is something more subtle sometimes, and sometimes those mechanisms aren't there in terms of the kind of consequences for that kind of behavior, and of course the risks of that, of reporting it, and will I face retaliation kind of thing, especially I think in the very vulnerable young artist, emerging artist stage. And I think it really does go back to society and industry wise that it needs to change, because the institutions can only reflect what's happening in society and in the industry. And I think the more precedent there is for that action to be taken, the better, the more that change can happen. But unless, again, we have that representation of the board, of the administration, of everyone, people are not going to, it's not going to, that change is not going to happen, because frankly, I know for myself, being a racialized person, is I perceive things, or I experience things, and oftentimes what I've heard, especially my PGSS Equity and Diversity Commissioner role at McGill with the graduate students, or really students of all kinds, but I heard a lot from graduate students where they will report something to the institution or the department. They report it again and again, and 3-4 times. Sometimes they're dismissed, or they are asked questioned. Did you really experience this? And it's very disheartening when someone is going through that kind of experience, and then they're not believed, they're questioned by it, and oftentimes the people questioning are not people of color or people who are marginalized, because they don't have that lived experience of what it is to experience that. So again, we really need that diversity, we really need that solidarity, and we need good allies who understand, even if they haven't lived through it, but also people with those lived experiences to be in those spaces, so that they can be believed and that serious action can be taken, because it is not, I was listening to a discussion where someone was saying in their opinion, there are no microaggressions, they're all aggressions, because whether it's a small statement or not, there's still things that linger with me, even just from last week or last month, or a number of years ago, that it was just one comment, one look, one seemingly small thing that can have a big impact on our psyche, our experience moving forward. So I really, really, yeah, I'm really passionate too about seeing that change happen, because it does need to happen at a really big level, for sure.
So I can have a question to Karen to Karen in particular, but anybody can answer. Mike as well can answer. The question is, as you mentioned, and as I saw on in your bio, you are attracted to tackle certain topics that relate to your background. Is that something that you are starting to see? Maybe the question would be put, are starting to see that you need to move out of, you need to do more general topics, or also the other side of the question maybe is also, if those issues weren't coming from your background, would you have ventured into art at all? Or what role did your background have into making you venture into art?
No, it's a great question. Like, in a way, I started, yeah, the first film I did was on the Chinese Tax Exclusion Act. So it was on some levels a very personal film, and it was a film that really kind of formed me as a filmmaker, and having a voice. But prior to that, I was actually not even interested in doing documentary. I was kind of pursuing more fiction film, and it was really in the experience of being with the community and seeing the power of like real storytelling to have an impact, and to be that I was kind of sold on documentary after that point. But I was also very conscious of this idea of like being pigeonholed into like only telling one kind of story or one kind of point of view. So the next film I did was actually like, the first film I did was, almost 20 years ago now. And it's only so many years later I'm coming back to this kind of subject. But the second film I did was on the refugee system in Canada. In a way, it piggybacked off of the Chinese head tax film, because it was about all these like really racist immigration laws against the Chinese in Canada. But at the screenings for that film, sometimes there'd be people from whatever background, and they'd be like, I feel your story. I understand this kind of racist immigration system. And it started getting me thinking, well, what are, immigrants today facing? And people who don't even necessarily choose to be here, like in the refugee situation, they're fleeing a place they love dearly, and then they're kind of treated here as like being a terrorist, or being, like we're very like untrusting of these people claiming refugee status. So it was from there, I bridged out into larger, wider subjects. There's always a race lens to what I do. There's always a kind of a gendered lens. I try to put a woman's point of view in there, or a wider point of view. But yeah, no, it's important in a way not to get pigeonholed, but also in a way to make sure that your point of view, or you're bringing your experience with you into the point of view of filmmaking. And I'm not, I don't mean like I have to have like a Chinese Canadian perspective on everything, but realizing, like, I think the strongest takeaway for me doing that first film is realizing like I'm mixed race, right? So I basically grew up thinking the Chinese side of my family is like the quote unquote foreign part of Canada. And it was from doing that film that I realized it's like, but the Chinese side of me is like the most Canadian. It's the most ingrained in the building of the country, or like what it is. So it's like I take ownership, but now that I learned that history, I own that history. So I go into all the other stories kind of questioning, like, is this version of history really what happened? What about these other people we never heard from, or these voices that are never there? So I think like that's what I kind of take that into other subjects. But for sure, yeah, no, I try to go into much wider subject matter, but really grounding it in what I learned from my own community, voicing their own experience here.
All right, we're just starting to creep up on the 90-minute mark here. So if there are no more questions, I think we can probably end things early. Thank you to so much to all three of our panelists for participating in this. It's been such a pleasure to meet all of you and to hear about your work, and I really look forward to seeing what all of you do next. Thank you to everyone for listening in from wherever you are, and thank you to Tees Dunya Theatre for making all this possible. Please be sure to tune in for the next panel, The Costs of EDI, which Zachary Couture will be moderating, Monday, 7:30, and it's also going to be on Zoom. Yeah. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And happy Year of the Tiger, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Happy
Thanks,
Lunar New
everyone.
Year.
Ciao.
Ciao.